Today is not much about us. We've invited a very distinguished panel for you to meet and listen to, and hopefully we'll have time for questions. But just real quickly on us, and if you have time at the end, I'm happy to talk more about our organization. But Win This Fight has taken a very unique approach to fighting human trafficking, which is by, like we say, going after the head of the snake. So we are going after the money that enables this absolutely horrific Scrooge. And of course, this is a very big enterprise. So we have to go at it from all different angles. This is one of the angles that we are going with, but obviously we're working with other organizations. So without any more delay, I do want to introduce you to our very distinguished panel. I'm so happy to announce, and hopefully they're on here because I can't see the Zoom screen. So I'll start introducing them in no particular order. Our first panel is Sir Richard Hawkes, who is the CEO of British Asian Trust, which is a charity founded by the Prince of Wales, who, as we all know, is the future King of England, Prince Charles. Now, this foundation is very close to my heart personally because of all the work that they are doing in South Asia. That's where I grew up. And I saw firsthand how a huge amount of population and poverty makes that area a hotbed for human trafficking, which is why I'm personally very grateful to organizations like British Asian Trust and the work they're doing on the ground there. And we really look forward to speaking with them more. And another thing very interesting that I like what they're doing is they have created vehicles for Asian philanthropists and philanthropists from UK to identify grassroots initiatives to work with in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. So Richard, thank you and welcome. I can't see you, but I'm sure the moment you start talking, I will see you. And let me introduce our other panelists as well, Ambassador Luis de Baca, who is a lawyer and a diplomat and was who served under the Obama administration as ambassador at large to monitor and combat trafficking in persons. Also worked with the Department of Justice in the similar area as well. So we're looking forward to speaking with them. Our third panelist, Dr. Chris White, we just learned is not able to join us. So hopefully in another time he will be here because he's done a lot of work on the ground in Afghanistan when he worked with DARPA. So we miss him, but a part of me is selfishly grateful because I have so many questions for our two panelists that I was afraid we'll run out of time. So with that, we'll get started. I do see Richard. I will start with you. I don't know if you're able to see me or you see a tiny version of me somewhere here.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
First of all, welcome.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. So I'll start with you, Richard. Now, there are a lot of people on Zoom from all over the world, but still primarily it's an American audience here. So could you talk to us a little about who is British Asian Trust? What is your focus? Why were you created?
Yes, of course. Well, first of all, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to join you today. Incidentally, I was actually in the States the day before yesterday. I was there for a week last week in Texas visiting my daughter who's studying at the University of Texas in Austin. So I should have got my timings more coordinated and stopped off in New York with you on the way back, and then I could have been with you in person. But anyway, I'm very glad to be joining you in this way. Jaspreet, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. Just to explain, as you said, I'm the Chief Executive of the British Asian Trust. And we were established about 13 years ago by a combination of, as you said, His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, who came together with some of the leading figures from the South Asian community in the UK. In the UK, when we talk about South Asia, we mean the Indian subcontinent, so India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. And there are 3 million British Asians, so 3 million people in the UK whose heritage is from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. And the Prince of Wales came together with leaders from those communities, some of the top business leaders and celebrities, to create the British Asian Trust. The intention being that this would be a British Asian diaspora-led organisation. So all of our trustees, our advisory councils, and so on are made up of people from the community, to galvanise the wider diaspora community to address poverty and inequality across South Asia. So to identify the issues that that the diaspora and wider South Asians could get involved in through us as a vehicle to address, whether that was about anti-trafficking, mental health, education, livelihoods, and we recently started working in conservation as well. So our work is in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh mainly. We have some programs in Sri Lanka. And the one other thing I'd say is that, as I'm sure many of you will know, if you know any South Asian origin entrepreneurs, business leaders, and so on, they're the people that have set the culture of our organisation, which means that it is constantly about scale, about innovation, about cost effectiveness, about getting the absolute maximum of every pound that can be given. We're a charitable organisation, but we operate in a fairly ruthless way where we're absolutely focused on outcomes and impact, on keeping costs to an absolute minimum, and really using innovative approaches like development impact bonds and other forms of impact investing, so as to make the biggest possible impact that we can across that South Asian region. Jaspreet, if you're saying anything, I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry about that. Richard, thank you for that. And I'm really glad you mentioned about impact and measurement, because yesterday in our audience, a lot of people are talking about, are you measuring impact? So thank you so much for bringing that up. And thank you also mentioning the word that even though it's a non-profited foundation, you're working at it, you're looking at it literally like running a business ruthlessly because you want results.
Totally.
And I think that is really what a lot of people, when they hear nonprofits, a lot of people are really tired of that, because many times they just exist and nothing goes on. And so it's really refreshing to hear that, because even for our perspective, we are looking to say, how do we function really like a business, almost like a startup ruthlessly, that we need to make things happen. So thank you for that. I'll switch to Ambassador de Baca. Thank you so much for being here. Now, you've worked in some very prominent organizations, Department of Justice, Department of State, you're ambassador at large in the human trafficking space. I'm curious to understand, I'm sure audience as well, is how does the role differ? Meaning, if you're a DOJ, what lens is DOJ looking at trafficking from, as opposed to the State Department, or as opposed to when you were ambassador at large? I mean, what's in the purview? And also, in your opinion, which one did you think made the most impact? Or I'm sure it was a different impact, but if you had to pick.
Yeah, I think that, one of the things, Jaspreet, that's so important when thinking about the problem of human trafficking, when thinking about the problem of modern slavery, whatever we're going to call it, there's so many labels, is that this problem has only ever been addressed successfully when it's being attacked from a multifaceted direction. Part of that is because it manifests itself so differently in different places. It could be brick kiln operators in northern India. It could be artisanal mining with children in parts of Africa that's going into the technology. The computers and cell phones that we all have with us today very probably have some slave-made sourcing as far as the coltan, tantalum, et cetera, that makes them be able to work. It also, though, manifests itself in local enslaved prostitution or child prostitution cases. And in the United States, it I think, often ends up impacting itself on vulnerable communities, whether those are vulnerable because of immigration status, because of race and ethnicity, because of gender, or because of mental health. So I was so happy to see that today's kind of entire morning is going to be focused on a lot of those different things, because those are often the drivers of human trafficking. I think as far as the U.S. government, or any government for that matter, what we've seen is that you have to have a holistic approach. A lot of governments about 20 years ago, when the United Nations updated the anti-slavery treaty with what's called the Palermo Protocol, the Trafficking Protocol, a lot of governments ran out and had their interior ministry or home ministries assigned to it. And they reacted exactly the way that a law enforcement branch would. They thought a lot about border security. They thought a lot about who was there and who wasn't. And for the longest time, even in our discussions with the UK, you'd have people saying, "Oh, well, we're looking out for, the Russian models who are being brought in for prostitution." And it wasn't really until the cockle pickers died at Morecambe Bay, when the tide came in, killing 19 Chinese workers, that it kind of opened up the British understanding that you can't just be looking outside. You have to look at your own situations. And in the United States, that's agriculture, that's building, that's everything around us, really, when it comes down to it. If there are vulnerable people who are not being served by the communities. So the answer to your question, in some ways, is that everybody has to be bringing to it. It wasn't until we were able to bring in the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Education Department, until we were able to bring everybody together like that, start thinking of it with a development lens, to start thinking of it with a social service lens, we were just chasing the bad guys. And we still have to chase the bad guys, and we still have to put them out of business. But at the end of the day, we also have to serve the victims and the survivors.
Ambassador Baca, thank you for that. So I like what you mentioned, that I don't obviously like that part, that we are still chasing the bad guys, but it seems like we will continue to do that. But having that approach, and it's encouraging to know that from a government organization, the openness to understand and realize that it's not them alone, and which is why we do need a lot of private organizations, someone like a British Asian Trust, many others, in order to look at it in a holistic way and go at it from all different angles to address it. Which actually brings me to a related question for Richard. Like in South Asia, you are actually working with the local governments there to do all the work on the ground. Could you talk a bit about that, please?
Yeah, and let me first of all just echo the exactly what the ambassador said. It's the only way of dealing with these problems and these issues is to bring as many people as you can together to work in a holistic way. I think, unfortunately, very often in the charity sector, historically, people have tended to deal with the problem after it's become a problem, and they'll look at how do you help people who need help, rather than looking at the real causes of an issue. And so you have to look holistically with something like child trafficking in India, where unfortunately the scale of it is just enormous. You cannot just do, for example, rescues of children. You have to look holistically. You have to look at supply chains. You've got to look at the private sector. You have to look at prevention. You have to look at how you work with the government, and so on. So, Jaspreet, you specifically asked about working with the government. I mean, we believe absolutely that in order to affect long-term sustainable change, we must complement and strengthen the government mechanisms, the local government mechanisms, and so on, rather than setting up parallel systems. We've been working on a very large program in Jaipur, in Rajasthan, which is, and the aim of that program is to make Jaipur a child labour-free city. And unfortunately, as I'm sure some of you may know, There is a lot of child labour in Jaipur. It's the trinkets and the jewellery capital of India, and unfortunately, the children with very small hands are often the people that are kidnapped, trafficked to Jaipur, to the workshops, to work in those factories. And what we've been doing is working really closely. Yes, there are some of our teams and the partner organisations that do rescues and return kids and support them back with their families. But as I said, working with the local government systems, the judiciary, the police, and so on is absolutely crucial. And we've been doing exactly that, working with the police, working with the judicial systems, to strengthen the prosecution of traffickers and employers. We've had caseworkers who've helped to bring strong evidence against traffickers. We've been petitioning the courts to use video testimony from child survivors rather than in-person evidence, which has been accepted. And we've been working to capacity build and sensitize judges and the police and so on. And all of this over the past year has resulted in a record 6 convictions for traffickers, 4 of them for life imprisonment. So up until 18 months ago, there haven't been any convictions for traffickers. In the last year, there's now been 6 convictions, and 4 of them for sent to prison for life. So by changing and working with and strengthening those local infrastructures, working with the local government, the judiciary, the police, and so on, that is the way to affect the long-term systemic change that we really want to be bringing about.
Richard, thank you for that. And you brought up something very interesting on supply chain, which I know I've heard you talk about this before. I've heard Ambassador de Baca speak about it as well. And would love to know, I mean, right now in America, when you say supply chain, everyone's thinking of shortage of goods, but obviously we are talking of supply chain related to human slavery. So since you're already talking, could you talk a bit about that as well, Richard? You were talking of, I believe you want to create transparency in supply chains.
Yeah, so as I've hopefully conveyed, our approach is really based on partnering with people, and in this case, say partnering with the private sector. So working together to try and enable and affect change within that sector, rather than campaigning and from the outside. And again, I'll use the example of in Jaipur, where we've been working with local producers to map out supply chains and document any practices within those chains that need to be changed. On finding cases of child labour or other equally bad, if there are other bad practices, we then work with those companies to address the changes and bring about the changes that need to be brought about. So, for example, we provide educational opportunities to families of employees, making sure that their children are enrolled and stay in school. We conduct regular announced and unannounced audits of suppliers. And what we're finding is this greater compliance helps to reduce demand for child labour and also helps producers clean up their supply chains, enabling them to both meet global compliance requirements and market themselves as clean providers.
Thank you. Ambassador de Baca, I know you've talked of supply chains as well. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, there's, if I could, maybe switching a little bit from kind of what the problem is, although the problem is very much, that slave-tainted goods, whether it's some of the things that we've talked about already today that might be coming out with child labor or even child slave labor, or things that are coming out with prison labor, especially from the Uyghur Autonomous Zone and other areas. But I think there's also that notion of kind of what can foundations, what can philanthropists, and what should people be doing. I think that one of the things that we always have to be very careful about, and I was glad that Sir Richard kind of laid out the process by which they're doing their work, because it's exactly what we'd like to see, is this very careful approach to empower the local and state governmental actors, the people who actually are the ones who should be using, for lack of a better term, the state monopoly on violence or the state monopoly on the law. We've seen well-intentioned non-governmental organizations based in the United States and elsewhere who have created a lot of mischief and wreaked a lot of havoc under the guise of doing anti-trafficking work from a rescue perspective around the world. And they come in sometimes claiming to have been, former SAS or former U.S. Special Forces or others who had no mission fighting human trafficking, but basically say that qualifies them to bust down doors and drag people out. Many times in Southeast Asia, it's been folks who did not want to be dragged out of wherever they were working or what have you. So that notion of very careful work, how does one do supply chain work? How does one do business intelligence? How does one look at money laundering or other things like that without becoming kind of this, for lack of a better word, great white savior, rescuer type of situation? And I think it's with that kind of long-term respect, working with the leaders, working with survivor communities, and really backing their play, rather than necessarily coming in to bust down doors or what have you. I think that the supply chain work that's very interesting right now that's going on, really the transparency movement over the last few years, certainly the last decade, whether it's the California Supply Chain Transparency Act, whether it's the UK law and now the Australian law that follows up, or whether it's the related issues around due diligence in broader human rights things that we see with the French law or some of the proposals in the EU right now. It's basically trying to say, get this information out so that people can do something with it. So whether it's the Business and Human Rights Center, whether it's Transparentum, whether it's the folks over at Liberty Shared, you now have a number of organizations that are doing the really hard work. They're linking up where that palm oil is coming from. They're looking at the shipping manifests. They're trying to figure out who are the insurers of the boats that turn out to have all of that slavery that is rampant in the Pacific seafood long-line trawlers. It's not just about who is the captain who's abusing the Indonesian or Filipino men. It's who are the owners. Trace it back up to Taiwan, trace it back up to Korea, but also who's insuring it? Who are the financiers? Where's the money coming from? Those are tools that I think a lot of folks have used, whether it's for counterterrorism, whether it's money laundering in the other contexts, such as organized crime, but traditionally haven't necessarily been using for human trafficking. And I think that what that ends up doing is it incentivizes the companies to then start thinking of this as a compliance issue and getting their own lawyers involved. So they're looking at cleaning up their own supply chains. At the end of the day, though, it's going to take a reassessment of how procurement gets done. It's going to take a reassessment of how buying gets done. And it's going to, frankly, take a reassessment of how much corruption lead companies in the West are going to accept 2 and 3 tiers down in their supply chain. So I think we're all in this together. And if we can support each other, and if we can place those philanthropic investments and support on the groups that are actually doing the hard work, maybe you don't always hear their names, but they're the ones who Interpol turns to. They're the ones who the FBI or Scotland Yard turn to when they come across the transom with the information about palm oil, cotton, etc.
Thank you. Asher, I just have a follow-up question on that. You have also created the incredible gold standard for anti-trafficking. What is that? Does that exist? What exactly does it entail?
Well, I think that the there's two things if you were going to, say, and we don't have, I don't have a stamp or anything like that I can give people. But, I think that when you really think about, kind of based on the reporting that the United States did over the last 21 years now, against the standards, the international standards for combating trafficking in persons, as articulated by the 2000 Trafficking in Persons law here in the United States, but also through the Palermo Protocol at the UN. The gold standard really is a country that is following what we call the 3P paradigm, where prevention, protection, and prosecution end up being co-equal. It's not just the state's interest in punishing that criminal. It ends up being protection of the victims, which also includes not deporting them, and incorporating them into your society. If you find somebody who is cleaning a house in Kuala Lumpur, who thought she was going to be having a good job in a garment factory and came down from Cambodia and was locked up for 3 or 4 years, she has already, for instance, contributed to Malaysian society. And the way to deal with her is to actually transition her into being able to be part of that society rather than simply jailing her and deporting her for working in a job that she wasn't authorized to. So first of all, there's that 3P paradigm: prevention, protection, and prosecution. And then secondly, there's something that we call the victim-centered approach, which is making your decisions based on the needs of the survivors. Helping them, everything has to be about helping them from going to active traumatized victim to survivor, and then turning around and having that feedback from the survivor community inform everything that we end up doing. So I think that if you've got an effort that you can say is truly looking to advance the 3P paradigm and is victim-centered, then I think that at that point you're really looking at a gold standard effort.
I know we've got a few minutes left, and I already have so many more questions, but I'll ask you one last question to both of you. Obviously, you're both incredibly talented. You've both got great resumes. I didn't even go through everything, or that's all I would have read in half an hour. But what motivated, for Richard, I'll start with you. What motivated you to be part of this NGO? You have had a stellar career. You could have done anything. And Ambassador Baca, I'll ask you the same question after that. And the reason I ask you that is because, unlike any nonprofit, being in something like this, it takes an emotional toll on you. You see a child hurt, it's different. So I'd love to know more, because we want more people like you in this world.
So Richard, do you want to take that one first?
Okay, well, I'm delighted you've come to the conclusion that I'm really talented, because you hardly know me, but I'll definitely pass that on to all of my colleagues, none of whom would agree, I'm sure. I would say, I've been very fortunate. I've spent the best part of 30 years working in the not-for-profit sector, with a desire, ultimately, very simplistically, to make the world a better place. That's why those of us who are in the sector are in it. I think we want to change the world. There's nothing that's more horrific than child trafficking and child labor and forced child marriage. It totally destroys lives. And I think if you want to be in this fight against poverty and disadvantage and making the world a better place, you've got to try and deal with some of the most difficult, extreme, and challenging issues. And for me, this was one of the big programs of the British Asian Trust, together with other programs like mental health, for example, which is another huge challenge. And so, if you want to be doing something to make things better, then dealing with issues like this is challenging, but it's incredibly motivating as well. And I just finished, linking to the point, the other question that you mentioned. Of course, it can take a toll on you. I was in Jaipur a couple of years ago, just before the COVID outbreak, and I met in one of our partner organisations a young boy who was 6 years old who'd been rescued, and it turned out that he had spent 6 months having his hand nailed to the floor every night because he'd been trying to escape. You know, this was a 6-year-old kid who'd had his hand nailed to the floor every night. And when you have children yourself, like I do, and you compare the worlds and the lives that they've had just by the good fortune of birth to a small boy, 6 years old, who's been nailed to the floor, it's disgusting. And if you feel that you can play a role in doing something about that at a strategic level, there's nothing more motivating.
Yeah, and I'd second that. In fact, I jumped off video for a second to go over to the other part of my office and grab this. This is a piece of construction paper that was written, for those of you who don't speak Spanish, it basically says, with love and thanks from your friends. These are 56 deaf and hearing impaired Mexican nationals who were lured to the United States with promises of good jobs and a better life, only to be put out on a begging ring in New York City in the streets and subways. And for 3 years, they were out there, and almost everybody in New York saw them. And nobody actually stopped to ask them if they were okay. And we discovered them because they themselves found a way to write a note with the help of an American deaf person, and were able to bridge the language gap. And the things that I learned from them, the things that we then took and put into the new law in 2000, the things that we took to the UN to get the trafficking protocol, they all start and stop with people like them, the survivors themselves. And so when I get down about either the trauma that I'm seeing or that I'm taking on, what I realize is that I'm giving a voice to people like them, folks who for so long think that they thought correctly that they didn't have a voice here in America or around the world. So the ink is fading on this little thing, but my memory and the things that drive me from them and their example certainly does not fade.
That's incredible. Thank you. And I know we're nearing the end of time, so thank you so much. But I also want to take a moment to thank Mark Sainer and 3621 for always putting the spotlight on this. And Sir Richard Hawkes, Ambassador Baca, thank you so much. Really appreciate you being here.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed.
Come join our 361 firm community of investors and thought leaders. We have a lot of events created by the community as we collaborate on investments and philanthropic interests. Join us.